Good morning, everyone. My name is DrAlanBarnard. I'm CEO of Goldwood Research Labs, and it's a huge privilege to have you attending this program, the Odyssey Program. The objective of the program is very simple. It's providing you with a step-by-step process that you can use to help you make better, faster decisions when it really matters. We make around 1 million decisions every month. Most of those decisions are made in our fast and automatic mode of thinking, and luckily most of them are inconsequential, right? We have to decide what to wear, what to eat, what to do, who to pay attention to. But a few of them really matters. And if you get those right or wrong, it can change your life or your organization. So what today is about is to share with you some of the latest research on how to make better, faster decisions when it really matters. And that requires that we have an understanding about what are the avoidable and consequential decision mistakes we make when we try to make decisions. So that will be part of the first part of this morning. Is I'll be sharing with you some insights, standing on the shoulders of giants, which is the process that we advance any knowledge through, as we look at who are the giants in the fields of decision making. And we try to understand what they've contributed to this field of knowledge. And we look for inconsistencies or gaps in that and see how could we benefit from what they've developed. How can we keep the benefits of the methods that they've developed while at the same time paying attention to the limitations in either scope or application, and see if our methods, the ones that we try to develop new, can keep those benefits while at the same time overcoming its limitations. So in the first part of this morning, I'll be sharing with you some of these research insights that we've gained. I'll then introduce this new method that we've developed called the 5-step Procon Cloud. And then the rest of the day is going to be you applying this method on any issue that you are facing at the moment. And it is an issue that must be putting pressure on you to make some kind of change in your life or your organization. It's really important that it's an issue that's putting pressure on you to make a change. You will, of course, see that you can use this method to gain insights about why other people got stuck or made a bad decision. And we'll give you enough examples as we'll go through to show you the range of applications. But for today, the most insight that you will gain is when you apply this method on something that's really important to you right now. That's putting pressure on you to make a change, that you're either worried that you might overreact and make a bad decision or bad choice, or that you will continue to procrastinate and that there's no real value of procrastinating. Because sometimes there's value in procrastinating. We're waiting to gather more information, to build up confidence, whatever we're waiting for. Sometimes there is. But if you start feeling that probably there's no further value in procrastinating, those are good decisions to apply.
The Odyssey, as you probably know, the foundation of Odyssey is an exciting but challenging journey. And whenever we're trying to gain insights into why we behave in certain ways or why other things or people behave in certain ways, it's always an odyssey. It's exciting but challenging. Why exciting? Because there's a potential of discovering new knowledge that could be very useful and valuable. Why is it challenging? Because probably many people have experienced these problems before for maybe hundreds or even thousands of years, and we're trying to create new insights, and that's always challenging. A little bit of background about me and the Odyssey program. As I mentioned, I'm CEO of Goldwood Research Labs. I had the incredible opportunity of working directly with Dr. Goldwood for almost 25 years. I started off as an industrial engineer, working in large manufacturing companies as head of engineering. Later moved on to process company. I was head of world-class manufacturing for South African breweries, producing beer that later bought out Miller. And I started working with Dr. Goldwood on a one-to-one basis, doing very large international projects in the late 1990s. Around 2005, I started
thinking about registering for my PhD, and I was looking for opportunities to apply what I was really passionate about. I've always been passionate about helping people discover and unlock their inherent potential, both individuals and organizations. And I wanted to do my PhD in it. And that's very closely aligned to decision making. It's kind of in a way trying to understand, why do good people make and often repeat bad decisions? It's an area that I've been passionate about for many, many years. In fact, going all the way back to meeting Dr. AlanBarnard for the first time in 1991. It was an incredible opportunity. I had been given a copy of the goal by my older brother. He said, you know, I know you like reading, and I know you make good summaries, so do you mind reading the book, giving me a good summary, and if you can give me some advice on how to implement in my company. He was working for a big steel plant at that time. You know, that'll be just fabulous. And the book got me already in the foreword. And the reason for that is, in that foreword, Dr. AlanBarnard articulated in the most eloquent way the essence of the scientific method. He said, if you want to make a breakthrough in any area or domain that you are passionate about, you just need to follow 2 steps. Step 1 is have the courage to face inconsistencies. An inconsistency in science is that we've come up with a theory or law that predicted the behavior of a certain part of the universe, and then we observe it and we see that there's a gap between what we predicted and what we observed. And immediately, it then moves us to the next step, which is having the courage to challenge some basic assumptions related to that inconsistency or expectation gap. Either your measurement is wrong, right, or your prediction was wrong. It could be one of those 2 things. And then once you are sure that it's neither your measurement or your prediction, then you start really challenging the assumptions below that. So that's how I started, as I realized that an inconsistency is simply a different way of defining what an expectation gap is. We all have expectations. When we go to school, we have an expectation about the grades that we should get. And then when we don't, it creates an expectation gap. And that expectation gap can have one of 2 impacts on us. It can inspire us to close it, or it can demotivate us and cause us to get stuck and think to ourselves, why even bother? Why try? Because the gap is just so big. The same is true for business. We have an expectation gap based on our own expectations or commitments that we've made to our investors, for example, around the profitability. And then we have reality. That expectation gap, if we have the courage to face it, can provide us with the key to know that there's an improvement opportunity here. And that's where the second step comes in, is imagine you have an expectation gap. There's a target at the top and a reality below it. And it's not really the size of that gap that matters. It's the consequences of not closing it or closing it that matters. So a small gap, which we'll later see in some of our discussions, can have a huge impact. And a big gap can have a small impact, depending on the nature of the system that we're dealing with. Step 2 is challenging basic assumptions. There's only 2 assumptions that I could challenge. The assumptions on which my expectation was based. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe my expectation was too high. For example, how many of you are married? Right? So when you get married and you stand there and you say, I commit that this will work forever until one of us is no longer there, right? There's an expectation gap that somehow we will be different than the average, right? If we paid attention to the average, the statistics is pretty horrible, right? 50% divorce rate. Of the ones that don't get a divorce, 80% of you will be terribly unhappy. And somehow we think that we will be different. So it could be that simply, if we had paid attention to the evidence and the data, our expectation was just too high. But of course, we have to be open to the second question, which is maybe the expectation was correct, but the assumptions on which the actions to realize that expectation was based, maybe that's where the problem is. And what I got from those simple 2 steps is to say, yes, I could probably make a contribution in making people aware of how big sometimes the gaps are between their current level of performance and their inherent level of potential. But that's conceptually not that difficult. What the challenge is, how do we get people to challenge the assumptions behind these? As Tracy mentioned, we all know that we all have self-limiting assumptions or beliefs. But how do we find them? And that became my passion. And of course, I realized how challenging that is. Because sometimes you can discover them by spending a lot of money on a top psychologist, and 5 or 10 years later, they might tell you, this is the reason why your relationships don't work out, your jobs don't work out, or whatever it is. But is it possible, is there a fast track that we can use ourselves? And that became my passion. In 2005, I had an opportunity to resurrect the Odyssey program, and it was part of my PhD research. The title of my research is Developing a Systematic Way to Help Individuals and Organizations Identify and Unlock Their Inherent Potential. And the hypothesis was that we could come up with a process that we tested in the private sector, then in the public sector, and then with individuals. That within 5 days, it can take them through from the point of ignorant about how much inherent potential there really is within them or their organization, all the way to a detailed action plan on how to better exploit and not waste that inherent potential. And that's how we started in 2005 with the first Odyssey program. Over that time period, we kept on learning. Every single Odyssey program was an experiment for us. And part of learning on an ongoing basis is to check what worked. And let's keep those parts. And then what didn't work, and let's discard those parts and see whether they should be replaced or not, or enhanced, or simply taken away. In fact, one of the most powerful quotes that I keep up wherever I'm sitting working, as prime prominence, is that perfection of any design, whether you're designing a product or service or methodology, perfection is not when you cannot add anything more. It's when you cannot take anything away. That's the essence of elegance, of coming up with a process or product or service that's so simple that only what's absolutely necessary is in that. And that's been part of our journey, is to constantly see how can we make the process simpler, doing the training simpler, and then can we develop an app that can make it easier for people to go. And that's always our challenge, is finding this inherent simplicity. In fact, starting off with our standing on the shoulders of giants quote, this is probably the most profound statement that I ever read, and made an impact and made it really difficult for me to decide whether to go and study engineering or science. Jean-Baptiste Perrin, who was the first one to validate some of Einstein's theories around the molecular nature of the universe, said the following. He said, the ultimate goal of science is to substitute visible complexity with invisible simplicity. And I immediately said, that's what I want to do. I want to see how to make this simplicity visible. If you think about E equal to mc squared, right? It's a governing law of the universe, incredibly simple, but it explains incredibly complex behaviors of the universe. And what intrigued me was, can this be applied to something that we previously called soft sciences? Because if you think about humans, and specifically decision-making of humans, can you see the visible complexity in that? each of you are different. You come from different backgrounds. You've had different experiences. You've had different genes. Where is the inherent simplicity when it comes to decision-making, human decision-making, or decision-making within organisms, living organisms? Is there also some invisible simplicity in the way that we all make decisions? Before they said, no, everything's different. That's why the only way to make breakthroughs is to have one-on-one coaching, because every one of you is unique, and therefore finding out where you are stuck, why you are stuck, will require a specialist approach. Until they found out that there's this universal algorithm for human decision-making, and it turns out for all decision-making by living organisms. If you think about decision-making, it varies everything from sensory choices, right, to what I see and hear. Just imagine you're in a dark place and you see something. Did I see it or did I not? Right? You can't replicate that experience now, but you have to make a decision. Should I act on it? I'm not sure, so there's some noise in what your senses picked up, and there's some signal. And the difficult to distinguish between noise and signal is what makes a decision difficult. Is, did I really see that? Did I hear that? How should I react? And these are all triggering, of course, our heuristics of fight, flight, freeze. But by nature, that decision is complicated or difficult because it's so difficult to distinguish between signal and noise. Lots of noise, and that's part of why does it take so long to build up intuition, because it takes a long time to decide what we should be ignoring when we're making decisions versus what we should be considering. All the way through to conundrums, real conundrums like what and who to pay attention to. So that's a range of decision making, and what I found out was that the brain deals with these complex type of decisions in exactly the same way. It takes decisions by accumulating the available statistical evidence and then committing to make a decision when that evidence exceeds a threshold. So essentially what it's saying is, if you're making a decision, for example, around risk, right? We know that some people are more risk averse than others. But how did I make a decision? It turns out that for whatever reason, it could be genetics or their experience, they decide on a threshold for risk. How much risk can I tolerate? And even though they are considering many other things about whether to take a new job, get married, have kids, there's this threshold around the level of risk that they can tolerate. And what the brain does is it's gathering evidence, and as soon as it hits the first threshold, it's ready to make a decision. As soon as there's any evidence, for example, of any risk, they'll decide not to do it. Compared to somebody else that does have a risk tolerance, but their primary focus is on the threshold regarding to how satisfying this will be, or how much I can learn, or how much money I can make. But they follow exactly the same process. So there's visible complexity in that we all have different thresholds around all these various aspects that we are considering when we're making decisions. But the process of making the decision is exactly the same. Once there is a threshold and there's a time constraint, the brain will keep on accumulating evidence from what's available until it exceeds one of those thresholds. And the first one it exceeds, that's when it commits to a decision. Does that make sense to everybody? And as we'll go through, you'll see practically how that applies to any decision that you make. And kind of taking these thresholds, or the things that we consider, from the subconscious mind into the conscious mind provides us with huge insights about why good people often make and repeat bad decisions. The second giant that I think is highly relevant to what we are doing is Nassim Taleb, that developed this framework called anti-fragile. And he made a very interesting observation. He said, the type of things that stresses us in life or stresses organizations, both positive and negative stresses, the kind of events that happen that we didn't expect, those things you can't predict accurately, ever. You really should give up on that expectation that you can accurately predict what will go right or wrong in your life or in your business. But what you can accurately predict is how you will likely respond to that positive or negative stress. And that's useful to know. And what he developed is a framework or classification based on how a system, a person or organization, will respond to a positive and a negative stress. So let's look at the first one. He called it fragile. This could be a fragile person. It could be a fragile business. It could be a fragile economy. He said the following interesting correlation is known, is that when there's a positive stress on the system, they get limited gain from it. So imagine you're a single person business. You have a bit of spare capacity to do a bit more work, and suddenly you get 100% more work. Can you see that you can capitalize on it, but only up to the limit of your capacity? So maybe during an upturn in the market, you can make 20% more profit, but that's about it, unless you're willing to employ more people. So there's limited gain during an upturn. And it doesn't matter how big that positive stress is, the gain is kind of limited. However, during a downturn, if suddenly you lose 20 or 30 or 50% of your clients, you could go bankrupt. And that kind of represents the unlimited pain side. There's asymmetry in how you or your business responds to a positive or negative stress. And because the asymmetry is against you, you are fragile. Because even if you have equal amount of good years or bad years, over time, because you're harmed more by a bad year than what you benefit from a good year, over time it accumulates, right? And your performance will keep on going down. This is also true for people. If you think about somebody that we might define as clinically depressed, right? My engineering understanding of that, and you need to check that with a psychologist in the room, using this framework is now very simple, is to say these are potentially people that somehow are harmed much more by a bad day than what they potentially could benefit from a good day. And over time, even if they have randomness in terms of good days or bad days, which we all have, over time, the damages will accumulate until they can no longer cope with it. And it makes perfect sense. Whereas if you have somebody else that has an opposite reaction, they will deal very differently to the same type of environment with exactly the same type of stresses. So a fragile environment is simply limited gain, unlimited pain. Therefore, it's harmed by volatility. The more volatile the environment, even if it's random or even if it's in your favor, you will be harmed by it. Taleb asked, so what's the opposite of fragile? And people said robust. And he said, yes and no. So let's see what the mathematical function looks like. So this is a concave curve for those that are interested in being reminded a little bit about mathematics. This is a kind of a sigmoidal curve, right? And basically what it says is that this system, by just looking at how they respond to stress, I know nothing else about the system. This could be a whole economy. It could be an individual organism. The only thing I know about is how they would respond to stress, positive, negative stress. So for an organism, a negative stress would be, I've run out of food. Positive stress, there's an abundance of food, right? Is that they somehow have figured out how to limit the pain during a downturn or during failures or during a bad day. But those same rules probably also limits the gain that they could have during the upturn, during successes. And as a result, as long as there's randomness in that volatility, they're not really harmed by it. Of course, if it's a bad year, they'll lose a bit of money. If it's a good year, they'll make a bit of money. But over time, those should cancel out. The last one is what the real opposite is of fragile. And this is the word that Taleb coined, called anti-fragile. He said this stress response is convex in nature. So this system has figured out how to limit the pain during a downturn or during a bad day, but at the same time have allowed themselves to fully capitalize on a good day or project success. As a result, even if they had random failures and successes, for example, product launches, new product launches, right? We don't know which of the products that we've developed are going to be successful or not. What this is saying is that as long as they have enough of these product launches that has asymmetry in their favor, which means the damage that it will do to the business if it fails is small in comparison to the upside if it succeeds, they will keep on growing and being more and more successful over time. And this was really fascinating because what he defined, and I was very fortunate to spend some time with him in London for about 3 days, and we looked at how we can apply these insights to businesses and to people, is to say, maybe this is the nature of an entrepreneur, right? Very small percentage of the population that might be born with it, we don't know, or through experience found out that this is a little bit more useful in terms of stress response than this and definitely that. But they, of course, are harmed a little bit by failures. They're human beings, right? They get disappointed. In fact, many of us had an opportunity to get to know Dr. Ellie Goldred very well. And when things failed, he was not just disappointed, he was often angry. Mostly about himself, right? But for those that were close, we got punished, believe me. But what was amazing about him is he recovered very quickly. Why? Because everything he did, he treated as an experiment. And what he tried to do in the design, in retrospect, what I noticed is that he tried to make sure that whatever experiment we're doing, doesn't matter how confident you are about the success rate of this experiment, he designed it in a way where the downside, at least to him, was small in comparison to the potential upside. Now, if you came along and you got excited by this, and you invested your house into this experiment, you could lose everything, right? Because you didn't pay attention to this thing. There was no asymmetry for you in terms of your favor. The pain, if it failed, in many cases were much worse than the potential benefit if it succeeded. And I think this is a very useful framework that we'll use as we go through the day to remind ourselves, because at the end of the day, what do we want to come up with? We've got some kind of breakthrough that we want to make, right? And that breakthrough is going to be turned into an experiment that we're going to go and test. So the final criteria that you want to apply is to say, if this experiment fails, how do I limit the downside? If it succeeds, how do I fully capitalize on the upside? So I don't have unlimited pain or unlimited gain, right? So in summary, fragile systems are organizations, countries, people that is harmed more by downturns or failures than what they can gain from an equivalent upturn or success. Robust organizations, countries, people are ones that are harmed the same by downturn versus an upturn, or by a good day versus a bad day. So over time, they'll be okay. Whereas the anti-fragile ones, and that to me is what our objective should be, not just for organizations, but also for us as individuals. I think it's a much more useful framework or goal to think about, rather than think how can we be more effective or efficient, we should be thinking about how can we be more anti-fragile, definitely more robust. How can we be more anti-fragile? Because anti-fragile people, anti-fragile businesses, anti-fragile countries are harmed less by a downturn than what they benefit from an upturn. I'll share with you later a little bit how we use simulation modeling within our organization to help test any of these rules. But something that you might all resonate with is, if you think about Uber, how do they limit the downside for them, for Uber, during a downturn? How do I do that? They don't own the cars, right? They don't own the drivers. if there's a downturn and it no longer becomes profitable for drivers to drive, they will find automatically alternative things. Uber will not be stuck with this huge overhead. Does it make sense? So they've been able to figure out how to limit the pain during a downturn. Of course they will suffer, their profits will go down, but only up to a point. How do they fully capitalize on a good day? Any of you use Uber? Yeah. Right? What happens when the demand exceeds the supply? Surge pricing, right? That allows not just them, but also the drivers to fully capitalize on a good day. And as long as that asymmetry is in their favor, over time they'll become bigger and stronger and more profitable. It's inherent in the design. But as soon as they change a rule that would cause them to limit the gain that they could get during an upturn, they will automatically switch back to robust. It will stagnate their level of growth. And if they are idiotic enough to go and change that, it can take them back to fragile. And that's something that we've seen organizations, big, strong organizations, been around for 100 years, very profitable, make one bad decision, and the organization is gone. And there's enough examples of that, right? So the reason I've included this is that it's a useful way of thinking about the choices or the decisions that we're making. Make sure that whatever decision you make, whatever option you exercise, is an option that has more upside if it works than downside if it fails. Right? And the bigger that asymmetry, the better. If you can have 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 to 20, those are the type of options. And that's the last point here is when I read this book, Taleb was an options trader. And options traders are successful because they know which options to buy and when or which ones to exercise. And I realized that an option is kind of the same thing as a change that we can implement in our life or an organization. The official definition of an option is something that gives you the right without an obligation. So you're buying the right on buying this share at a certain price, but you don't have an obligation to do it. You can decide whether to exercise the option or not. The worst downside is that whatever you paid for that option, that's what you can lose. So rather than buying a $10 share, you're buying an option on that share for $1. So if the share goes up or down, depending on which option you bought, you can either lose a maximum of $1 per share, or you can gain massively on both the upside or downside. And I think the same as options are like changes that we implement in our life. At any change, we have a right to do it, but we don't have an obligation. So make sure you select good options, good changes to exercise. And one way of deciding if it's a good option or not is that it meets these criteria. That at least there's limited pain and gain, or limited pain but unlimited gain. You figured out how to fully capitalize on it if it really works. Some fun examples, and I see some of you take pictures and take notes. You're welcome to do that, but we'll also share with you all the slides. Right? So please just keep that in mind. But sometimes people take notes. They want to take a photo of it exactly. You're most welcome to do that. But think about the following. Some of you might say, I'm in corporate. I'm a little bit frustrated in the corporate. I want to do something that's really exciting, and that it sounds really exciting to start my own company. And what this does is says, depending on how you would respond to stress, could be really important of which option to exercise. So let's think about this. If you start this company and it's wildly successful, and you go, okay, I'm a little bit happy, kind of expected, I'm pretty good at what I do, expected the business to succeed, and the biggest upside I will get is, it'll make me a little bit happy. Versus if it fails, I'll be suicidal, which means much bigger pain if it fails than upside if it succeeds. Then at least in terms of this decision, you are fragile. Don't do it. Bad idea. If you say, look, whether it succeeds or not, I'll be a little bit disappointed if it fails. I'll be a little bit happy if it succeeds. You're pretty robust. You can go either way. don't spend years studying about this. Just do it and try it out. Whereas if you say, look, if it fails, I've got a bit of a buffer. I'll be sad, disappointed, frustrated maybe a little bit or for a short time. But if it succeeds, it'll be amazing. Those are the type of people that should start their own companies. Does that make sense to everybody? So, and we've tested this framework even with kids, right? We don't use all the technical terms, but to say, how do you decide whether to make a change? Right? So what are you considering doing? Let's see, how would you feel if this thing really works well? Versus how would you feel if it doesn't? And we use this little diagram and we get them to plot the little dots and we say, okay, based on that, what do you think you should do? And of course, there are many others. Getting into a new relationship, really committing to quit a bad habit, and a decision to have children. This is an interesting one. People that struggle to quit a bad habit is intuitively they somehow feel that they would be harmed more if their attempt to quit fails than what they would benefit if it succeeded. And that's what I keep on procrastinating. And they should trust their intuition, but also check it and challenge it from time to time. So you could add value to them to show them that if they fail, it's not going to kill them. Right? Whereas if it succeeds, it could be changing their life. That's the way to get them unstuck. Rather than keep on assuming it's because of ignorance and giving them all the benefits of quitting or the downside of not quitting. That will have no impact on them if this is the way that they are making decisions. Remember, they are gathering evidence up to a threshold and then they decide. These are two fundamental thresholds that we use, the level of gain that we will get if it succeeds versus the level of pain. You'll also notice here that we are not even considering the likely outcome. All that we are paying attention to here is the best case and the worst case. It turns out that that's really what we should be using to inform our decision making. Because if I asked you, what do you think the likely outcome will be for your business to succeed? How would you answer that question? How much statistical evidence would you have to gather to overcome all the biases that you've had? It would take years. Compared to just best case, worst case scenario, how would that make you feel? So I hope that was useful. The last giant that we want to cover, two giants in fact, is Dr. Ellie Goldratt, someone that many of us had the privilege to study, to become friends with, to learn from. Often not just what to do, but what not to do, right? One of the first discussions I asked him was to talk about our bottleneck. Where's our bottleneck? Where's our constraint? What really limits us from making better, faster decisions? For example, a decision like, how do I transform my organization or myself? And we knew that the idea of assumptions or beliefs was really powerful. There was something in there that said, there's a certain assumption or belief that could be enabling or limiting. And what we realized very quickly when we started looking at this is that it's not useful to think of assumptions or beliefs as right or wrong, or good or bad. It is useful to think about them as whether they are helpful or harmful. So believing that you can do something, is that helpful or harmful? What do you think? Believing that you can do something, is that a helpful belief or an assumption, or is it a harmful one? Some of you say helpful. Exactly, right? It depends. If I think that I can walk across a rope between two buildings and I haven't practiced, then believing I can is a really harmful assumption. Why? Because the downside if I fail is much, much bigger than the potential upside if I succeed. Does it make sense? It can be helpful if it gets me to try. Why should I try? Because the downside if I fail is small compared to the upside if I succeed. Make sense? So very early on in our research, we had this insight to say that we need to start thinking about assumptions or beliefs, not as good versus bad, and I'm going to try to convince you that your belief or assumption is bad or right or wrong. It's more, is it helpful or is it harmful? And that goes for any assumption or belief about what we're capable of, what other people are doing, even something like religion. Is it useful to argue about religion? Is the belief in a God, is that right or wrong? A better question is it helping you or not? If it helps you, you should keep on believing. If not, then maybe you should consider stopping. If it's harming you, then definitely stop, right? So this is an insight that we had early on, but we started going deeper to say, what is the bottleneck regarding that? What is the scarce resource? Because the assumption or belief is a type of decision. And of course, the bottleneck is always at the top of the bottle. So applying Goldratt's 5 focusing steps to finding our bottleneck was looking at, could it be lack of wisdom or information? And what we found out was no. In almost every situation that we looked at, there was much more information than what we really needed. In fact, in most cases, there was just too much. Where did we find a shortage was in our level of attention. And that was quite a big insight around when we started this research around 2001, 2002, is our limited attention is our scarcest resource. And a simple test that you can do is a thought experiment. Think about it yourself. The number of things that demand your attention or could benefit from your attention, will it always exceed your available attention? And for most of us, if not all, the answer will always be yes. It's not just a temporary bottleneck, it's permanent. So if we go to step 2 of the 5 focusing steps that says, fine, now you've identified this constraint, how do I better exploit it? That was our next step. But we started doing research. I wanted to see, were we the first ones to discover this simple thing? Of course, Dr. Ellie Goldratt started publishing later on that management attention is the ultimate constraint also in organizations. But I found this quote from Dr. Herbert Simon way before this, 1973 already. He wrote this beautiful paper. He was one of the pioneers, for those that don't know him, of operations research, artificial intelligence, decision sciences, thinking about how more and more the issue is not problem solving, more and more the issue is decision making. This was his quote. He said, the information processing systems of our contemporary world swim in an exceedingly rich soup of data and information. In a world of this kind, the scarce resource is not data or even information. It is the processing capacity to attend to information. Attention is the chief bottleneck, and he actually used those words, in organizational activity. And the bottleneck becomes narrower and narrower as we move to the top of the organization. And top is a little asterisk because he talked about the top as the top management and also the top experts within that organization or that domain. Why? Because when it really matters, you want to have access to the top person, right? So even if they're a little bit better than their peers, they attract a disproportional demand on themselves. And that makes them the bottleneck. Secondly, they typically have access to more data and more information, again, turning them into the bottleneck. So this was an interesting validation that our research was validated by an insight that predates us by quite a few years. So how do we better exploit and not waste the system constraint? So we've got this shortage. Whenever we look at a system where the demand exceeds the supply, there's only 2 options we have to close the gap, right? We can reduce the demand, or we can increase the supply. So how do we reduce the demand on our attention? Practically, what do we do? What do you do? filter important things, right? What is important and urgent, right? What is urgent but not important? So we develop frameworks to try and filter. But that often just helps us to prioritize. And here was a key insight for us. Prioritization just changes the sequence in the queue of things waiting for us. It doesn't shorten the queue. And that's why in most cases prioritization doesn't help. We need to actually stop things, not just reprioritize. That's how we can truly reduce the demand, because all that happens if we downgrade a priority, something that was unimportant and not urgent becomes urgent. And then it has to get attention at some point. So this year, the advice is to actually look at your own list, all the things that demand your attention, and agree with the stakeholders which of these things you can stop doing, stop measuring. In fact, for many of our projects, this is the first step that we implement. Why? Why should the first step almost always be identifying and letting people know what they can stop doing or measuring? Because if we don't do that, where will they get the attention from to make the positive changes? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So that's pretty good. Okay, so that can reduce the demand, but what we'll see is it will still exceed our available supply. So what we need to do is we need to start thinking about what makes up that gap. And all that we did was we said, what if we just call that gap bad decisions? If you think about meeting a person for the first time, we make an instantaneous decision often about whether we like them or not, whether we trust them or not. And then they disappoint us maybe. And we look back, we say, why did I make this bad decision? The question is, could I have avoided it based on the information that I had on hand? And often I couldn't have avoided it. And by investing time to do root cause analysis is just a complete waste of our limited attention. In complex systems, many of the effects that we see are completely out of our hands. They are the result of patterns, of rules that have been implemented some time ago. There's not physical causes of things. It's when I have a pattern of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4 doesn't cause 5. It's just part of the pattern, right? So if I suddenly see 5 and I go, what caused it? Oh, it must be 4. No, it's not the cause, it's just the pattern. Why does a pattern happen? Because there's a set of rules that causes the system to behave in this way. So it's really important that when we apply this technique to our business or to ourselves, often we must realize that there's nothing we could have done to have avoided this mistake. We must rather pay attention to say, can it happen again? If it can, how do we buffer ourselves against it? How do we detect it faster? How can we correct it faster? Simple control theory. But there's a big chunk that is avoidable. So what makes up those gaps? And I've identified 3 potential causes of avoidable and consequential mistakes. The first one is ignorance, inertia, and then ineptitude. So let me briefly give you a common definition for them. Unavoidable means we will never know. Stop trying to figure out. It's just the complexity of the system makes it unavoidable. Doesn't matter how much analysis we'll do, we'll never really know what caused the Second World War. I could come up with a theory, you could come up with a theory. There's no practical way of testing it. So why try? Just give up on it and say it happened. How do we make sure it doesn't happen again? Or if it's starting to happen, that we can detect it and buff ourselves against it. Ignorance is I or we didn't know, but somebody else did. Right? So it is theoretically possible to have known. We love dealing with all decision mistakes as if it's caused by ignorance. There's a very simple experiment that you could do to check if it was really ignorance. And you can test it with your kids or your partner. Tell them so that they can't say I didn't know and see if their behavior changes. Do you agree? Simple way of testing it. If really it was, I didn't know, okay, now I told you, now you know, did it change your behavior? No. Let's take a practical one. How many of you multitask? Do you know that multitasking is bad for you? Would it be of huge value if I spend the rest of the day telling you the positives of stopping and the negatives if you don't? I mean, some of you might get some new insights, but would it change your tendency to multitask? Probably not. So most likely, it's inertia or ineptitude. Inertia is, I knew, and yet I didn't do anything about it. So we make most of our decisions using our intuition, and generally speaking, making decisions using our intuition or our gut feel or our fight, freeze, flight responses is a good idea unless this is the area that we want to look at today. It's the ones where there's an unless. Unless you haven't yet developed the intuition. So here should be the rule. Use your intuition unless you haven't yet developed good intuition in that domain. There's a reason why it takes us 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. You've heard that statistic, right? And it's approximately right. Why? Because it takes that amount of time to detect patterns, right? To pick up useful correlations, to get feedback about what works and what doesn't work. Whether you're a chess player or an advanced salesperson or a design engineer, it takes time to develop intuition around a specific matter if there's complexity involved. So that's one area that becomes really important. Okay. If any of you want some more information about that, please grab me during one of the breaks on that. So what other reasons do we have not to use our intuition? Let's see. It was developed based mainly on the local or short-term considerations of the outcome of that decision. Right, so we were at a buffet last night, and you look at that piece of strawberry New York cheesecake, right? What's going through your mind is how it will make you feel right now, how it will activate the reward part of the brain and go, you deserve it, you've had a long week. It will release the dopamine injection, right, and we'll feel amazing. We are not paying attention at all to the long-term impact. It's not that we're ignorant of the long-term impact, but at that moment, we're not really paying attention to it, or the impact that this will have on our whole body, the whole system. So imagine you had a little app that as you were making that decision, it runs a simulation and it shows you what the 5-year impact is going to be of this decision, right? And what it's doing to the other parts of your body. And it's fascinating when you look at these research, how people seek research that backs up their decisions, right? We don't do the opposite. I was in my house the other day with my wife, and there was a story on breakfast TV. She loves drinking wine, right? And she deserves it. Looking after 2 boys is a tough job, right? So you need to be able to give yourself a break from time to time. But there was research that was published and shared by this poor woman announcer that said, we have some bad news for those that drink wine. Every single glass of wine reduces your life by 30 minutes. Now that's a shocking statistic, right? Will it influence your decision about whether to have that glass of wine or maybe that second glass of wine? It might, because previously you could say, I don't know. We solved this problem by looking at how can we use advanced technologies like simulation modeling to help us predict not just the system-wide impact of our decisions, but the long-term impact of our decisions. Often, static simulation models is good enough. For example, if I have a company that has 100 million in sales and 50 million in variable cost. So it gives us a throughput or contribution margin of 50, and I have operating expenses of 45, and that gives me a net profit of 5. And I want to check if I can increase my average selling price by just 1%, how much will my profit go up? Now, one way that the human mind makes decisions is it tries to find a similar question that I know how to answer if it's going to take some time, because it's trying not to use its attention. It doesn't want to slow down the thinking. It tries to use the fast and automatic way of doing it. So what I've seen even CPAs do, when you ask them this question, they say our net margin on sales is 10%, right? Or 5% in this case. So what they'll do is to say, if you increase sales by 1 million, 1%, then the net profit impact of that will only be 50,000, right? 5% of the 1 million. So they'll say, you know, this will go to that if we can increase sales by just 1%. If they had slowed down their thinking just a little bit, they could have easily predicted to say, if this goes up to 101, if that increase came from price, which means my variable cost won't go up, my operating expenses won't go up, that whole 1 million will drop to the bottom line, and I'll get a profit of 6 million now. That's a non-linear change, right? A 1% increase in average selling price, either by just reducing discounts, selling directly to the consumer rather than through a wholesaler, or actually increasing my price by just 1%, will have a 20x impact on my net profit. And that's the problem that we face here is when these impacts are counterintuitive or non-linear, we really struggle because we want to try to make it simple, but we make it too simple. So just a little bit of effort. Sometimes a static model like this could really help. Sometimes you need some more complex models that are dynamic. The last one, which is what we will be looking at today, is why else is it a bad idea to use our intuition when it comes to decision making, especially when it really matters, is that it was developed, our intuition was developed, we don't realize it, to what extent our intuition was developed based on very strong emotions. And these strong emotions typically involve, on the one side, exaggerated fears of loss and risk that can cause us to procrastinate. The foundation of inertia is some exaggerated fear of loss or risk. The foundation of overreacting is an exaggerated frustration with the status quo or an exaggerated expectation of the future. And those are the inherent simplicity within all of decision making, at least when it comes to human decision making that involves this last type. In one of Ellie's first books, he said that the reason why people make bad decisions is because of strong emotions. And if you think that you can trump strong emotions or overcome it with logic, you clearly haven't been married. Right? It doesn't work. It doesn't matter how eloquent our explanation is. If the reason for the fear or the frustration is a strong emotion, the only way to overcome a strong emotion is how? With an even stronger emotion. That's the only way. And there's two emotions that are even stronger. The one is fear-based. You're scared that this will happen. Let me give you something to be really scared about, right? We'll close down the whole business if you don't do this. That's a stronger emotion, and sometimes it's very effective, and sometimes it's the only way out. If you need people to take an action immediately, is you scare the living daylights out of them, right? And anybody that's been in a position of a senior executive will know that those, even though you've promised yourself you'll never do that, you will do it. Same with parents, right? You promised yourself, you looked at your parents and all the things that they were threatening you with, and they would go, I'll never do that. And then little Johnny is having a tantrum, right? And you're right there, and it's embarrassing. What do? You threaten them. It used to be with violence, right? That's how we got brought up. Now, something much more effective. No iPad for a month. Right? And the person, please, not the iPad. Can't you just smack me or send me to, no, iPad it is, right? Strong emotion. There is another way of overcoming strong emotions, which is a positive emotion. Making people feel part of something really special can trump fear. It can cause soldiers to go into battle, even to the extent that they'll offer their own life, because they feel part of a team. I have your back. In the same with organizations, if you can make stakeholders feel that they contributed towards creating a new idea, we know that that can overcome fear. So this is what we're going to be looking at today, is sharing with you the method that we've developed that we hope can make a measurable impact in this type of mistake. Right? So the scope of the method is limited. It's saying that if you are looking at trying to understand why you've made a bad decision in the past, either you overreacted when you probably knew you shouldn't have, that there wasn't really a big upside of it, and there could have been a big downside, or you underreacted, you procrastinated, then this method can really help. And the reason why it will help is you'll see that there's 5 steps in this process, and every step has been designed to expose a common bad assumption. Bad in terms of it's not helpful, right? So I think after this slide is a good time to take a break. We have an obstacle to overcome. So essentially what we're trying to do here is to say many of the decisions, maybe most, benefits from our fast and automatic way of making decisions. There's a huge upside. It allows us to pay attention to other things, right? So the more we can automate, the better. But there's sometimes an advantage to slow down our thinking. The downside of slowing down your thinking is that there's common pitfalls. Confirmation bias. Who of you have built a current reality tree of those that have been involved in theory of constraints? It is a fantastic, very sophisticated way of confirming your bias. It's almost unheard of that that type of method generates new insights. Why? Because the level of discipline that you need to check every single arrow, is this really causing that? Is it a major cause? Am I not just simplifying the system and that in fact it's a complex system that are governed mainly by patterns and not by individual causes is almost overwhelming. So the fact that I can connect 2 little bubbles with an arrow doesn't mean that the one causes the other. It means that my assumption is that the one causes the other. And if I'm elegant in explaining it, I can convince you. Or maybe the whole room. But does it change the reality? No. There's other ways that we need to confirm that. So it doesn't matter what root cause analysis method you use, there's a huge risk that all that you'll use it for is a communication tool, not an analysis tool. Many of these tools, including most of the ones that we've developed in theory of constraints, are fantastic communication tools. It helps us to communicate great complexity with some simple cause and effect relationships. But we have to be careful that that's really true. The other thing is overthinking. So we don't want to slow down our thinking to the extent that now we just got stuck in analysis paralysis. So how do we make sure we don't make these mistakes of ignorance, inertia, and ineptitude? And this is what the 5-step Procon Cloud process is going to aim to do. So we'll take a break now. If you can be back at 11 o'clock, we'll go through the final steps, and then you'll immediately start working on your own example. Thank you. See you back at 11.